is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to this Agenda Election Special. I'm Stephen Cole. The UK's third election in 4 years is over, but what message has the British electorate sent to the rest of the world? Boris Johnson's Conservatives are back in power with an unexpectedly large majority.
With this mandate and this majority, we will at last be able to do what? You've been paying attention.
So is Brexit really now a done deal? And exactly what does that mean for the European Union? And what now for the special relationship? Donald Trump's ready to talk trade as he faces his own 2020 election battle. So, with Boris Johnson back in number 10, what are going to be the political priorities now? And what does all of this mean for the future of the UK, both internally and, of course, more importantly, perhaps on the world stage? With me here in the studio are George Pascoe-Watson, former political editor of the Sun newspaper and now chairman at Portland Communications. Lorenzo Cordogno, former chief economist at Italy's finance ministry and now visiting professor at the London School of Economics. And from Republicans overseas, Errol Moorcoach. Let's start with you, George. It was billed as Britain's most important election for 70 years. Did it live up to the billing?
Absolutely, no question. And wherever you are in the world, you look at Britain now this weekend and you see a totally different country which is about to change enormously. Brexit will happen. Britain will leave the European Union. You have a prime minister with phenomenal strength now to shape the country in the way that he wants. I have to also say that Britain's opposition party, the Labour Party, is going to be tearing itself apart. The worst election they've ever had. And critically, the United Kingdom possibly on the brink of breaking up as Scotland faces a very different future, perhaps with an independence referendum just round the corner, and Scotland could break away from the UK. Indeed, huge gains by the SNP, and we'll talk about that a bit later in the Agenda Special. Lorenzo, what message has the electorate, the British electorate, sent into Europe and, for example, Italy?
Well, I would say for Europe, it's really up to the UK government to decide what's the future. I think it will be hugely important for Prime Minister Johnson to decide over the next few weeks, but certainly by June, because June is the deadline to decide on the extension for the deal, for the trade deal. And I think it's hugely important to decide the strategy. Whether Boris Johnson will go for a kind of skinny deal, if you wish, just services or whatever, or a more comprehensive. And depending on what is the strategy in the UK, the European leaders will react. I think there is a will to kind of find an agreement.
What, with the new team in Brussels?
Which is in the interest of everybody, I would say.
Okay, Errol, what message to the US and the rest of the world has Boris Johnson and the British electorate sent?
Well, it's sent a wonderful message. I mean, we have been sitting and hoping and praying for something like this to happen. And now that we can move forward with the big USA-UK trade deal, especially when you consider security services, the fact that our agencies share 80% of data, we were very, very skeptical of how we could continue that robust relationship with gentlemen like Mr. Corbyn, who is, a supporter of anti-American groups from Venezuela to Iran and all that. And now that we have this mandate that Boris Johnson has gotten, just like Donald Trump received a mandate from the American people, there's never been a better chance for our two countries to strengthen that bilateral tie and move forward, especially in the world of pharmaceuticals, automobiles, and petroleum, which are our three biggest factors. And keep in mind, we are the #1 and 2 direct foreign investment in each other's countries, and that's jobs, pensions, and the exact thing that both Labor and Conservatives want, and both Democrats and Republicans want. So it's never been a clear, more bright, opportune time for that.
Good to hear, Errol. But of course, this was the Brexit election. But before I get all your thoughts on that, let's hear from the historian, Sir Anthony Selden, who's written a biography of Theresa May, and which has just been published.
Britain in the last 3 years has been more divided than at any point since the period before the First World War. This is a serious, serious moment in British history. So the hope has to be the country, now that there's a clear path forward on Brexit, will pull together. The risk on the other side is that Scotland will become independent, that Ireland will unify, and that the great promise of Brexit, that the left-behind areas would be looked after, that in fact unemployment will rise and productivity will fall. But at best, there's an opportunity now for the country really to come together and play a role on the national, international stage greater than anything happened when Britain was part of the EU. We'll have to wait and see.
We will indeed have to wait and see, possibly until January the 31st, but I suspect, George Pascoe, it'll be earlier than that, because he's going to have to start the ball rolling over Christmas, isn't he?
Oh, there's no question. Parliament will start sitting at the beginning of next week, a couple of days' time, and we will be right the way through the week, running up to Christmas and even into Christmas week. This Prime Minister has now got a mandate. He has an agenda. He is determined to focus on, firstly, Brexit, and then shaping his own government and shaping the Conservative Party, actually, which is a big, big job. Don't forget, for viewers abroad, what Boris Johnson has done here has swept to power on the back of voters who have never voted for the Conservative Party, for a right-wing party in their lives, and neither have their ancestors before them.
Just poking on that point, before I come to Lorenzo, 3.9 million new voters registered in October. Most people thought they were young people. Most people thought they would all vote Labour. Are you saying possibly they didn't?
What I'm definitely saying is that Labour traditional supporters voted Conservative this time. Some of the new registrars definitely voted Conservative. Some of them didn't vote at all. The critical thing is, can Boris Johnson keep hold now of this massive coalition of British people for the next election, which will be perhaps not in 5 years' time? He's going to change the law so he can go to the country anytime he wants. And can he then also, at the same time, rebalance Britain's standing in the world? Is he going to come close to America in a way that we've been talking about with Errol? Or is he going to side more with China? And there is a divide and a debate to be had.
All right, well, we'll come to see what Errol thinks of that. But Lorenzo, what will economists make of this? Is this a good vote for the British economy? And how will the relationship, do you think, change economically with Europe?
Well, in the near term, I think there might be some kind of rebound in activity, because I think this whole uncertainty about Brexit has probably stopped investment activity, decision-making by companies and so forth. So I think in the near term, there might be some kind of rebound. Over the long term, Brexit is definitely a negative for the UK economy, but again, it depends on how policies shape up. I mean, there is a chance for the government to kind of turn into a positive scenario, but again, it depends very much on policies. By default, the UK economy will become less open, than in the past. But again, there is a chance to reopen the economy in the future.
If I could dive into it, I mean, the opposite view is actually this gives the Prime Minister a mandate to be much more open with the rest of the world, and also to rewrite our own laws and regulatory regime so that we take advantage of no longer having to go at the speed of the Europeans. That's what Boris Johnson's all about, and time will tell, but that's his win.
Yeah, that's definitely, but unfortunately we live in a world in which size matters. Sure. So a UK will be a much smaller country with much less leverage internationally, and that might become more challenging for the UK Prime Minister to master a good deal. But again, there is a chance.
Never underestimate Boris Johnson.
Absolutely.
That's the lesson here.
That's a good lesson, and people did before this election. Perhaps let's remind ourselves, I want to come to you, Errol, let's remind ourselves of one of the earliest international tweets that Mr. Johnson received from Donald Trump, which he posted very early this morning. And he said, Congratulations to Boris Johnson on his great win. Britain and the United States will now be free to strike a massive new trade deal after Brexit. This deal has the potential to be far bigger and more lucrative than any deal that could be made with the EU. Celebrate, Boris. Well, that all seems to be more than 140 characters to me. But so he's pretty clear, Errol, the US-UK deal to be done. What do you think that might look like?
I think that obviously with some of the hot button issues, especially with the NHS and certain things where he's had to get educated about what a sensitive topic that is, I think it's going to, as I said, focus on some of those key sectors in pharmaceuticals and automobiles, but also looking at the sort of changing sort of economic environment when it comes to drug prices. Keep in mind, a lot of drugs around the world, Americans, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, we're paying 5 times more. And we're subsidizing, not because, you know, we're good or bad people, but just through the pharmaceutical industry.
That was a very sensitive part of the election campaign.
Yes.
Is the NHS on the negotiating table? Do you think that was that fake news, or is there some validity to that accusation?
Well, the American strategy, I'm sure as we all know, is we throw the kitchen sink at a debate, and then we work backwards. And once we sort of understood the extreme sensitivities, there's room for work there, especially in the trade of pharmaceuticals.
Oh, hold on. What do you mean there's room for work there?
Well, there's room for work to find out what exactly is acceptable compared to what we want. Now, obviously, we would like to have a robust relationship in healthcare, but we don't want to offend our greatest allies, best friends in the world, and certainly understand those sensitivities. With that said, there is also a room for a very robust universal trade agreement that could incorporate smaller things that wouldn't be offensive or, you know, create too much consternation, as long as we work with Boris and we're sort of considerate of these things.
They obviously have a good relationship, George.
Well, the reality on trade and things like the pharmaceuticals is that the world of pharmaceuticals is way more advanced now than it was 20 years ago when the NHS and pharmaceutical last time that the trade deal was discussed. And it's only right and appropriate that the NHS gets the very best treatments, the very best drugs possible, and that does require a new negotiation with the US and other suppliers for that matter.
Yeah.
Okay, George and Errol talking, and the man in the middle, Lorenzo, where does all this leave European trade with the UK?
Again,
Because it's clearer with the US, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's clear. I think it's challenging with any kind of counterparty around the world, because and everything is up for negotiation now. So it depends. On the negotiation with the EU will be critical, and I think. Now it's a done deal that the UK will be out of the EU by the end of January, but then there will be another uncertainty that will open how the UK see itself in the future in the relationship with the EU. That is still to be defined. I think Boris Johnson was deliberately kind of ambiguous in the electoral campaign. I think now has to kind of clarify the position and to kind of clarify the strategy. Again, a comprehensive deal with the EU would not be hugely difficult, but needs to be indicated already now over the next few weeks in order to make sure that everything goes in that direction.
And Brussels, are they more ready to negotiate on trade than they were previously?
I think there are some red lines. In other words, I think there's no way that the UK can actually negotiate, again, a skinny deal on services only without any kind of counterpart on labour mobility. Okay, let's face it. And let's face it that there are many other aspects, many other sectors. So if the UK goes for a comprehensive deal, I think there will be a very, very open attitude in Brussels. Otherwise, you end up with some more difficult negotiations, which might actually produce also some additional uncertainty. But again, it will be the first step will be very much up to Boris Johnson.
I think that Boris Johnson's strength now, with this phenomenal strength here in the UK, is that he will turn up in Brussels differently. And I think he will be much more robust That's not to say he's going for a hard Brexit, but he will be much more robust and empowered to do so than I think Brussels expects.
Well, a lot more confidence. Certainly. We'll come back to you in a moment, gentlemen. Thank you very much. But still to come here on this Agenda Election Special, a question of nationalism. Will Scotland still be part of the UK by the time of the next election? And what does Boris Johnson's victory mean for UK relations and trade with China?
CGTN Europe.
And welcome back to this Agenda Election Special. We've considered what Europe and America might make of this election result, but how will it be received in China? Boris Johnson's campaign message was always get Brexit done, and he now has the mandate to do just that and start talks on the all-important trade deals he'll be looking to make with the rest of the world. Earlier this year, this is what the Chinese ambassador to the UK, Liu Xiaoming, told me about how China viewed the ongoing Brexit negotiations.
We certainly follow Brexit very closely because UK is a very important, not only business partner to China, but also our two countries have a lot of collaboration cross-border, politically, economically, culturally, and we are also two very important members, permanent members of the UN Security Council.
Yeah.
We have a broad agenda internationally. So we would like to see things be resolved smoothly, satisfactorily to both sides, to EU. Both UK and the EU are two important partners to China. So we wish you the best of luck. But we believe this is very much up to UK and EU.
I understand that, but is it easier for China to deal with the UK inside Europe? Because the UK is a bit of a conduit into Europe, isn't it? Or do you prefer to deal with Europe and Britain separately? What would be most advantageous to Britain?
It's very hard for us to make a choice. We only will try to make the best of what we can have. So I think there's both advantages for UK in EU and also both advantages for UK out of EU. So we have to make the best of what we can have. But UK is now building what they call it global Britain, and I think that will provide more opportunities for collaboration between China and UK.
Liu Xiaoming, the Chinese ambassador to the UK. So it would certainly seem that China has got just what the ambassador said they wanted, a degree of certainty. So what does this election result mean for UK-China relations? Well, joining me now from Beijing is Dr. Peter Ho from the London School of Economics Department of International Relations. Peter, of course, the money question is the UK free now to negotiate a free trade agreement with China?
Well, I think that question, the answer to that question is actually much more complicated than it seems, because in simple terms, it seems like when the UK is now leaving the EU, it would be free to negotiate a deal, but I think in fact you will see that China will not engage in an FTA, a free trade agreement with the UK before any clear trade agreement has been signed between the UK and the European Union. And as we know, this process has just only started. So that means that it will take quite some time before the contours of UK-EU agreement is visible, which means that it will take some time before the contours for a UK-China FTA free trade agreement will be visible as well.
Is that because, Peter, Beijing doesn't want to risk alienating its relationship with the EU?
Well, it's not just that simple. The thing is, again, that the economic relations are quite complicated. Of course, economically, the UK is much smaller than the EU. So for China, the relation with the EU is very important. So it needs to see how the relation develops with the UK and the EU first before it can strike a deal with the UK. And actually that also means that when you look at trade, it's quite uncertain what the possibilities are at this moment for a trade agreement between the United Kingdom and China.
All right, Dr. Peter Ho, many thanks indeed for joining us from Beijing. So that's the view from Beijing, but let's get some more thoughts from our election special panel, George Pascoe-Watson, Lorenzo Cordonio, and Errol Moorcoach. And what is interesting, George, we've just had the view about China, but I want to come back to domestic politics, because one of the important issues this election has thrown up, this landslide victory by the Conservatives, is also the increased vote for Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP. Are we then heading for a second referendum, but not one with Brussels, one with Scotland?
Well, there's no doubt that the increased support for the Nationalist Party in Scotland makes a second independence referendum inevitable, I would say. And which way will it go? Well, the way that the vote in the general election went last week suggests that we would see Scotland, which is my own country, saying goodbye to the United Kingdom. And there's a lot of reason for that, but the principal one is that Scotland as a whole voted to remain in the European Union. It will now be forced to leave the European Union, and the Scottish people feel quite angry about that. And that will drive a sense of nationalism. It will drive a sense of we should stand alone as a country and perhaps seek to rejoin the European Union. But of course, that's a fanciful hope, I'm afraid, for my fellow Scots. The complication of rejoining a bloc, of rejoining a currency, of inventing your own currency, of trying to find your way back into the European Union.
Good luck with that.
Huge.
Lorenzo, would Brussels welcome Scotland with open arms? I don't think it would.
Not immediately. I think, again, as he said, Scotland will have to kind of start all over again from scratches, effectively, and so it will take a number of years. Secondly, I would say they are not going to jump into another referendum immediately, because I think the big question mark is what would be the future relationship of the UK with the EU. And I think Scotland would be better advised to wait for how the situation evolves before making any decision. So I don't think Scotland will jump into another referendum immediately. But if the situation evolves and there is a deal with the EU, it's certainly possible that we get into another referendum.
It's in Boris Johnson's gift, a second referendum on Scotland. What could happen is the Scottish leader could hold an indicative referendum to show the strength of the people and their view in Scotland, to put pressure on Boris Johnson to say, look, you can't hold out much longer. You've got to give us another formal referendum.
Errol, Mr. Trump, close links, well, links literally, golf links mainly with Scotland. How would he see a Scottish referendum, do you think? Or how would America feel?
Well, as you know, he has a very robust golf portfolio across all over, and his family is historically from Scotland and Fife, MacLeod family. So he would see it in the same sense as how he sees the UK, where we look at nationalism not meaning isolationism in the US and the UK, and I believe Scotland also has to come into that factor. I will say that there is a certain cultural insensitivity, being that the UK is a sort of island nation, and having their terms dictated across the border shows a little bit of cultural insensitivity, which plays into Donald Trump and Boris Johnson's narrative. So obviously he does want to protect his golf courses, and I must say I've played them and they're quite nice.
All right, gentlemen, starting with George, just go across the panel for your final thoughts. I couldn't read this election in the campaign, and everybody worried about tactical voting. There were so many issues coming up, and in fact the turnout wasn't the highest, probably because of the weather. But your last thoughts? I mean, I'm surprised.
I'm not surprised. I had Boris Johnson down for a victory from a long way out.
I did have him down for victory, but not with this size.
But I was quite confident it would be big, and the reasons for that: one, this country does want to leave. Two, Boris Johnson is a character. People like him. He is not the establishment, a bit like Donald Trump. And number three, people could not stand Jeremy Corbyn and his approach to politics.
All right. Lorenzo, your final thoughts?
Yeah, I think the problem in the UK is an electoral system that basically gives no choice for the voters. And I fully agree. I mean, I was expecting such a victory, and I think I was expecting also such a big victory. I think if you are faced with a choice between Corbyn or Boris Johnson, then you have very little choice. And I think the result is that you end up with this kind of situation.
All right. And Errol, your last thoughts?
I think parallels between the Trump-Clinton campaign could be drawn between Boris and Corbyn, in the sense, and I don't mean to castigate the gentleman, but when you look at him in today's 21st century politics, there's a lot of optics. And no disrespect to him, but when you look at Boris, people like him. When you look at Jeremy Corbyn, in the same way that you look at Hillary Clinton, people have an inherent aversion to that kind of personality. There's certain little gaffes. It sounds very simple, but when he was pouring a pint incorrectly, and Boris Johnson can pour it, these things sound funny, but the optics in this new kind of presidential world, it's the 21st century, and if you want to win the 21st century, you can't use 20th century tactics.
All right, gentlemen, thank you all. I'll drink to that. We have to leave it there. George Pascoe, Watson, Lorenzo Codogno, and Errol Moorcoach, thank you all very much indeed for joining us here on this election special. A blue dawn has certainly broken. It was billed as the most important UK election for 70 years, but the Conservatives' worst nightmare, that Jeremy Corbyn would be walking unaided into 10 Downing Street, didn't happen. The Tories won what the Prime Minister called a stonking majority. This was the clearest message by British voters, both to Westminster and to Brussels. They'd had enough of the dithering, the paralysis of a Brexit, and they didn't like or trust Jeremy Corbyn. Nevertheless, up to then, it had been a real cliffhanger. The big fear by the Conservatives was that tactical voting would be used as a weapon. The Safety First manifesto was barely half the length of Labour's and a fraction of the cost. But the main plank of Tory reform was aimed at the introduction of an Australian-style points-based immigration system, ending preferential treatment for those from Europe. And of course, immigration was the defining issue of the referendum, and now it was playing a big part of this election too. But it wasn't clear during the campaign exactly what Labour was standing for, except that it was time for change. Boris Johnson now has to prioritise creating the conditions for the economy to flourish far outside London and the South East, and improve the NHS and the country's physical and digital infrastructure. This campaign hasn't just been about who the voters trusted, it was about who the voters chose to believe. And this time around, those voters have made it very clear exactly who that was. Just about everyone has breathed a sigh of relief at the result, possibly even some Labour, even some Remainers, because the vote means certainty has returned to UK politics. The pound has surged, and President Trump promised a massive and lucrative trade deal. Let's go out and get on with it. Let's get Brexit done. The words of Boris Johnson when it was confirmed he was going back to 10 Downing Street. Well, at least now he can put up his Christmas tree. Next week on the agenda, as the end of the year approaches, we revisit the best of the show this year as we hear from one of the world's first space tourists. And don't forget, for more agenda content, you can visit our website, or you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook. But for now, from me, Stephen Cole, and all the agenda team here in London, it's goodbye.